On the morning of March 7th, 1974, in Ellis County, Kansas, a woman named Margaret Dunbar buried her husband of 31 years in a cemetery overlooking the wheat fields they had worked together since 19. Harold Dunbar was 56 years old when his heart gave out. He died in the cab of his tractor, halfway through the spring plowing, with his hands still on the wheel and his eyes on the horizon. The neighbors who found him said he looked peaceful. Margaret wasn't sure if that was true or just something people say. The funeral was on a Thursday. By Saturday, the first visitor arrived with advice. "Margaret, you need to think practically now." It was Earl Kessler, who farmed the section to the north. He stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, speaking in the slow, careful tone men used when they thought women couldn't handle hard truths. 320 acres is a lot of land. Harold's been doing most of the work these last few years. Without him, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I appreciate you coming by, Earl," Margaret said. "The Hendersons would give you a fair price. They've been looking to expand. You could get something comfortable in town, live off the interest, not have to worry about—" I said, "I appreciate you coming by." Earl blinked. He wasn't used to being interrupted. "Margaret, I'm just trying to help. A woman alone, at your age, with all this land and that equipment sitting broken in the barn." "The equipment isn't broken, Earl. It's half repaired. Harold was working on it." "Same thing, isn't it? That combine hasn't run in 2 years. Nobody in the county can get parts for those old Massies anymore. And even if you could fix it, who's going to run it? Who's going to do the planting, the cultivating, the harvesting?" Margaret looked at Earl Kessler for a long moment. She had known him for 25 years. He had borrowed Harold's equipment half a dozen times. He had sat at this very table and eaten her pie and complimented her husband on having such a capable wife. But now Harold was dead, and suddenly she wasn't capable anymore. Suddenly she was a problem to be solved, a situation to be managed, a woman who needed to be told what to do. "Thank you for coming, Earl," she said again. "I'll keep your advice in mind." She didn't. Let me tell you about Margaret Dunbar, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand who she was before that morning in March. Margaret Holcomb was born in 1922, the only daughter of a railroad worker in Salina, Kansas. Her mother died when she was 7. Her father worked 60 hours a week and didn't know what to do with a daughter, so he mostly let her figure things out herself. She learned to cook by age 9 because nobody else was going to do it. She learned to sew by age 11 because clothes didn't mend themselves. She learned to fix things, pipes, hinges, the old Model T her father drove, because waiting for a man to do it meant waiting forever. In 1941, when she was 19, Margaret took a job as a secretary at a farm equipment dealership in Hayes. That's where she met Harold Dunbar. But here's the part that matters. That's also where she met Harold's father, William Dunbar. William Dunbar was 72 years old in 1941, a retired farmer who spent his days at the dealership helping out, which mostly meant telling stories to anyone who would listen and tinkering with equipment in the back shop. He'd been farming since 8. He'd survived 2 droughts, 1 depression, and a world war. He knew more about machinery than most of the mechanics who worked there, and for some reason he took a liking to Margaret. "You're not like the other girls," William told her once, watching her change a typewriter ribbon with quick, efficient movements. "You don't wait for someone else to fix your problems." "Can't afford to wait," Margaret said. "Things that need doing now." William laughed. "That's exactly right. That's exactly right." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want to learn something useful? Something most people have forgotten?" Margaret looked up from the typewriter. "What kind of something?" "Come to the back shop on your lunch break. I'll show you." Over the next 3 years, through her courtship with Harold, through their wedding in 1943, through Harold leaving for the war and coming back in 1945, William Dunbar taught Margaret everything he knew about engines. Not just how to drive them, how they worked, how the parts fit together, how to diagnose a problem by sound, by smell, by the way the machine hesitated, how to tear down a transmission and put it back together, how to rebuild a carburetor with nothing but hand tools and patience. "Why are you teaching me this?" Margaret asked once. "Harold knows all this. He'll be running the farm." William was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My wife, Eleanor, she died in 1980, influenza. I was 49 years old with 2 boys and 600 acres and no idea how to cook a meal or wash a shirt or do any of the things she'd done for 25 years. He wiped his hands on a rag, not looking at her. "It took me 3 years to learn what she knew. 3 years of burned dinners and ruined laundry and boys who went to school looking like orphans. And I thought to myself, if I'd known, if she'd taught me, if I hadn't just assumed she'd always be there." He looked at Margaret then, and his eyes were serious. "Harold's a good man, strong, hard-working, capable. But no man lives forever, Margaret. And when he's gone, whenever that is, whether it's next year or 50 years from now, you're going to be alone with a farm and equipment and 1,000 things that need fixing. And on that day, you'll either know how to fix them yourself, or you'll have to sell everything and start over." He handed her a wrench. "So let's make sure you know. If you're still with me, I need you to understand something about what happened after Harold died." Margaret Dunbar was 52 years old. She had been married for 31 years. She had raised 3 children, 2 sons who had moved to California, and a daughter who lived in Topeka. She had worked alongside Harold every planting season, every harvest, every day in between. But in 1974, in Ellis County, Kansas, none of that mattered, because she was a woman. And women didn't run farms. Oh, women worked on farms. Everyone knew that. Women drove tractors when there weren't enough men. Women kept the books, fed the crews, ran into town for parts. Women did 100 essential things that kept operations running. But own a farm? Manage a farm? Make the decisions about when to plant and what to sell and how to fix a broken combine? That was men's work. The second visitor came on Monday. It was Frank Morrison from the bank. "Mrs. Dunbar, I want to start by saying how sorry we all are about Harold. He was a good man, a good customer, and we valued our relationship with him." Margaret noticed the past tense, valued. "Thank you, Frank. Now I know this is difficult to think about, but we need to discuss the farm's financial situation. Harold had an operating line of credit with us, about $14,000 outstanding right now. With spring planting coming up, that's going to need to be addressed." "Addressed how?" Frank shifted in his chair. "Well, typically when there's a change in the primary operator of a farm, we like to review the account, make sure everything is in order, make sure the operation is going to be able to meet its obligations." "You want to know if I can pay back the loan?" "I want to know if the farm can pay back the loan, Mrs. Dunbar. Without Harold, without a working combine, with 320 acres to manage alone." He spread his hands. "I'm sure you understand our concern." Margaret understood perfectly. Frank Morrison was giving her the same message Earl Kessler had given her, just wrapped in banker's language. Sell, give up, let someone else take over. "The wheat's already in the ground," Margaret said. "Harold planted last fall, same as always. If I can get the combine running by July, I can harvest. If I can harvest, I can pay back your loan plus the interest." Frank looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Dunbar, that combine has been sitting in your barn for 2 years. Harold couldn't get it running and he knew more about engines than—" He stopped himself, but not quickly enough. "Than a woman? That's not what I was going to say." "Yes, it was." Margaret stood up. "I'll make my payment in August, Frank, same as Harold always did. If you want to foreclose before then, you'll have to take me to court." Frank Morrison left without finishing his coffee. "Now let me tell you about the combine, because that machine is the heart of this whole story." It was a 1962 Massey Ferguson 410, a pull-type combine that Harold had bought used in It wasn't fancy, wasn't powerful, wasn't new, but it had worked well for 6 years before something went wrong with the engine in the summer of 19. Harold had tried to fix it himself. He was a capable mechanic, good with tractors and trucks, But combines were different, more complicated, more specialized. The engine had a problem he couldn't diagnose, and the dealer in Hayes couldn't get parts for a 12-year-old Massey. So the combine sat in the barn, waiting for parts that never came, while Harold borrowed equipment from neighbors to get through the 72 and 73 harvests. He'd been working on it again that winter, Margaret knew. She'd seen him out in the barn, hunched over the engine, muttering to himself. He never said if he was making progress. Harold wasn't the kind of man who talked about things until they were done. The day after Frank Morrison's visit, Margaret walked out to the barn to see what she was dealing with. The combine sat in the dim light, covered with a layer of dust and chaff. The header was detached, leaning against the wall. The engine cowling was off, exposing the guts of the machine and the mess Harold had left behind. Parts were spread across the workbench. Some she recognized, some she didn't. There were handwritten notes in Harold's cramped writing, diagrams he'd drawn, pages torn from a manual. It looked like chaos, but Margaret had learned from William Dunbar. She knew that chaos was just order waiting to be understood. She spent the first day just looking, not touching anything, just looking, understanding what Harold had done and what he'd been trying to do, following his notes, studying his diagrams, piecing together the logic of his approach. By the end of that first day, she knew two things. First, Harold had been close, closer than he probably realized. He'd diagnosed the problem correctly, a worn camshaft that was causing the engine to misfire, but he hadn't been able to find a replacement part. Second, she knew where to find one. Let me pause here and explain something, because this is the moment that determined everything that came after. Back in 1972, when the combine first broke down, Harold had called every dealer in Kansas looking for a replacement camshaft. Nobody had one. The Massey Ferguson 410 had been discontinued in 1965, and parts were getting scarce. One dealer suggested he try junkyards. Another suggested he have a new camshaft machine from scratch, which would cost more than the combine was worth. Harold had given up on finding the part. He'd spent 2 years working around the problem, trying different solutions, getting nowhere. But Margaret remembered something. In 1956, 18 years earlier, William Dunbar had died at the age of 87. Before he died, he'd given Margaret a gift, a set of shelves in his old workshop, filled with parts he'd collected over 50 years of farming. Most of this is probably junk, William had told her, but some of it might be worth something someday. Parts they don't make anymore. Pieces for machines that haven't been built in 20 years. You never know what you might need. Margaret had kept those shelves, transferred them to her own barn after William's house was sold. Harold had teased her about it. What are you going to do with a carburetor from a 1928 Fordson? But she'd kept them anyway. She'd kept them because William had given them to her, because he'd taught her to value things other people overlooked, because she'd learned from him that the most valuable things are often the ones nobody's looking at. Now, standing in her barn, looking at Harold's unfinished work, Margaret walked to the back corner where William's shelves still stood, dusty, cobwebbed, untouched for years. She started at the top shelf and worked her way down, examining each part, checking it against the diagrams Harold had drawn. Camshafts, crankshafts, bearings, gears, parts from Fords and Farmalls and John Deeres and machines she couldn't even identify. On the third shelf, behind a box of ancient spark plugs, she found it. A camshaft wrapped in oiled paper, with a tag in William Dunbar's handwriting, MF 420 diesel, bought at auction 1963, good condition. Margaret stood there for a long time, holding that camshaft, feeling the weight of it in her hands. William had been dead for 18 years, Harold had been dead for less than a week, and somehow, from beyond both of their graves, they were still teaching her, still helping her. She went back to the combine and got to work. If you've ever rebuilt an engine, you know it's not something you do in a day. It's not even something you do in a week. It's a process, methodical, painstaking, full of setbacks and discoveries and moments when you're certain you've made a mistake that will ruin everything. Margaret worked on that combine for 3 months. Every morning she was in the barn by 6. Every evening she worked until the light failed. She followed Harold's notes where they existed and figured out the rest on her own. She made mistakes. She broke things. She cut her hands, bruised her knuckles, went to bed exhausted and woke up sore, and she kept going. The neighbors noticed, of course. Word spreads fast in a small county. By April, everyone in Ellis County knew that the Dunbar widow was trying to fix her dead husband's combine, and opinions were divided into 2 camps, those who thought she was brave and those who thought she was crazy. The second camp was larger. "She's going to hurt herself," Earl Kessler said at the feed store. "That engine weighs 500 pounds. What's she going to do when she needs to lift it?" "She's grieving," said Martha Pendleton, who worked at the diner. "People do strange things when they're grieving. She'll come to her senses." "Someone should talk to her children," Frank Morrison suggested. "Maybe they can make her see reason." Margaret's children did call. Her sons from California, her daughter from Topeka. They were worried. They offered to come help. They suggested gently that maybe selling wasn't such a bad idea. Margaret told them she loved them and she was fine and she'd call them when the combine was running. In May, something happened that almost ended everything. Margaret was reassembling the fuel injection system when a fitting slipped out of her greasy hands, fell into the engine block, and wedged itself somewhere she couldn't see or reach. She spent 6 hours trying to retrieve it. She used magnets, hooks, mirrors, anything she could think of. Nothing worked. The fitting was stuck in a place she couldn't access without taking the whole engine apart again. 3 weeks of work undone. That night, Margaret sat on an overturned bucket in her barn, covered in grease and diesel fuel, and cried for the first time since Harold's funeral. She cried because she was tired, because she was alone, because everyone had been right. She was a 52-year-old woman trying to do something that took trained mechanics weeks to accomplish, and she had no business being out here, and maybe Frank Morrison and Earl Kessler and everyone else knew something she didn't. Maybe she should just sell. She sat there for a long time, letting the tears come. And when they finally stopped, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. On the wall above the workbench, Harold had pinned a piece of paper. It was old, yellowed, and she'd walked past it 100 times without really looking at it. She got up and read it. It was a quote, written in Harold's hand. "The master has failed more times than the beginner has tried. Stephen McCraney." Below that, in different ink, added later, "For Margaret, who never quits." Margaret read those words 3 times. Then she wiped her face, picked up her tools, and went back to work. At 2 in the morning, she finally retrieved the fitting using a bent coat hanger and a flashlight held in her teeth. It took another week to get the fuel system reassembled correctly, but she didn't quit. On June 28, 1974, 113 days after Harold Dunbar's funeral, Margaret turned the key on the Massey Ferguson 410 combine. The engine coughed once, twice. A plume of black smoke burst from the exhaust. Then it caught. The sound that filled that barn was the most beautiful thing Margaret had ever heard. The rumble of an engine that hadn't run in 2 years. The rhythm of pistons firing in sequence. The mechanical heartbeat of a machine brought back to life. She sat in the operator's seat and let it run for 10 minutes, listening to every sound, watching every gauge, feeling the vibration through the frame. It wasn't perfect. There was a slight hesitation at low RPM that she'd need to adjust, but it was running. She had done it. Now let me jump forward, because the combine was just the beginning. What happened over the next 12 years is what turned Margaret Dunbar into a legend. The 1974 harvest was her first test. She cut 320 acres of wheat alone, running the combine 18 hours a day during the 10-day window when the crop was ready. She hired no one. She asked for no help. And when she delivered her grain to the elevator in Hayes, she had enough to pay back the bank loan, cover her operating costs, and put money aside for next year's seed. Frank Morrison didn't say anything when she walked into his office with the payment. He just took the check, stamped it received, and nodded. That was enough. The years that followed brought every challenge Kansas could throw at her. The drought of the wheat blight of 78, the price crash of 81 that drove half the farmers in the county into bankruptcy, the interest rate spike that made borrowing impossible. Margaret survived them all. She survived because she didn't owe money. Harold had always been conservative with debt, and she was more conservative still. While her neighbors were buying new equipment on credit, expanding their operations, gambling on next year's prices, Margaret kept her 320 acres and her old Massey Ferguson and her father-in-law's philosophy, don't bet what you can't afford to lose. She survived because she knew how to fix things. When the combine broke down, and it did, many times over those 12 years, she fixed it herself. When the tractor needed work, she did it herself. When the irrigation system failed, she tracked down the problem and replaced the parts with her own hands. And she survived because she was too stubborn to do anything else. The neighbors who had told her to sell eventually stopped giving advice. Some of them went bankrupt in the 80s crisis and sold their own farms. Some of them held on by the skin of their teeth, borrowing against equity that evaporated year by year. But the Dunbar farm stayed. Small, modest, unimpressive, but still there. Still producing. Still owned by the widow who had refused to leave. By 1986, Margaret Dunbar was 64 years old. Her hands were stiff with arthritis. Her knees hurt every morning. The 18-hour harvest days had become 12-hour days, then 10-hour days, then however many hours she could manage before her body demanded rest. She knew she couldn't do it forever. Nobody does. That spring, Margaret's granddaughter came to visit. Sarah was 24, recently finished with an agriculture degree from Kansas State, and uncertain about what to do with her life. She'd grown up in Topeka, far from the farm, but she'd spent summers with her grandmother as a child, following Margaret around the barn, handing her tools, asking endless questions about how things worked. "Grandma," Sarah said on the second day of her visit, "can you teach me to run the combine?" Margaret looked at her granddaughter, young, strong, eager, and felt something shift in her chest. "Why?" she asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Because I remember what Grandpa William taught you, and what you taught yourself. And I think that shouldn't disappear. I think someone should keep it going." Margaret smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled like that in years. "Well then," she said, "let's go to the barn." Over the next 3 months, Margaret taught Sarah everything she knew. Not just about the combine, but about the tractor, the irrigation system, the land itself, about reading the weather and predicting the market, and knowing when to plant and when to wait, about the way an engine sounds when it's running right, and the way it sounds when something's about to go wrong, about surviving when everyone tells you that you can't. In August of 1986, Sarah Dunbar ran the harvest for the first time. Margaret sat beside her in the cab, watching but not interfering, letting her granddaughter make her own mistakes and find her own solutions. The harvest took 12 days. When it was done, Sarah had brought in every bushel from those 320 acres, with Margaret only taking the controls twice, both times to demonstrate a technique, not to correct an error. That evening, they sat on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sun go down over the empty wheat fields. The combine was back in the barn, cleaned and maintained, ready for storage. The grain was at the elevator. Another year was done. "Grandma," Sarah said, "do you ever regret it? Staying? Doing it all yourself for so long?" Margaret thought about the question for a long time. "I regret that your grandfather died," she said finally. "I regret that I had to learn how to be alone. I regret every night I went to bed exhausted, and every morning I woke up hurting." She paused. "But do I regret not selling? Do I regret proving that I could do what everyone said I couldn't?" She shook her head. "Not for one single minute." Margaret Dunbar passed the farm to Sarah officially in 1988, 2 years after that first harvest together. She moved to a small house in Hayes, close enough to visit but far enough to let Sarah run things her own way. She lived another 11 years, dying peacefully in 1999 at the age of 77. By then, Sarah had expanded the operation to 480 acres and was running equipment that Margaret had never imagined. GPS-guided tractors, computerized combines, technology that would have seemed like science fiction But in the corner of the main barn, preserved under a canvas cover, sat the 1962 Massey Ferguson 410. Sarah kept it running, took it out once a year during harvest, ran a few passes across the field just to feel the connection to something older, something that had been saved when everyone said it couldn't be. The toolbox William Dunbar had given Margaret still sits on the same workbench. The shelves of old parts are still there, though they've been organized and cataloged now. And on the wall above the workbench, framed and protected behind glass, is that piece of paper Harold pinned there decades ago. The master has failed more times than the beginner has tried. For Margaret, who never quits, let me leave you with this. In 1974, when Margaret Dunbar decided not to sell her farm, everyone thought she was making a mistake. The neighbors thought it, the banker thought it, even her own children, in the privacy of their phone calls with each other, wondered if their mother had lost touch with reality. She was 52 years old. She was alone. She was trying to fix a machine that professional mechanics had given up on. She was attempting to run a 320-acre operation in an industry that had almost no place for women outside the kitchen and the account books. Everything was against her. But Margaret had something that couldn't be measured in acres or horsepower or bank balances. She had the knowledge that William Dunbar had given her 30 years earlier, knowledge he'd shared because he understood that the people we love won't always be there, and when they're gone, we have to know how to save ourselves. She had the stubbornness that comes from a lifetime of being underestimated, from being the railroad worker's daughter who learned to cook at 9, from being the secretary who stayed after hours to learn about engines, from being the farmer's wife who paid attention when no one expected her to. And she had the quiet faith that comes from knowing, deep in your bones, that the only person who gets to decide what you're capable of is you. They told her to sell. She fixed the combine instead. They said a woman couldn't run a farm alone. She ran it for 12 years. They predicted she'd fail, go broke, come crawling back asking for help. She never asked anyone for anything. And in the end, when the farms around her were being auctioned off, and the neighbors who had doubted her were signing away their land, Margaret Dunbar was still standing, still farming, still proving every single day that the people who tell you what you can't do are usually just afraid of what you might. So the next time someone laughs at your dreams, the next time someone says you're too old, too young, too inexperienced, too different, the next time the whole world seems to be telling you to give up and take the safe path and settle for less than you know you can be. Think about Margaret Dunbar, alone in her barn at 3 a.m., crying over a dropped fitting, reading her husband's note on the wall. Then wipe your face, pick up your tools, and get back to work. Because the only person who gets to decide what you're capable of is you, and that combine isn't going to fix itself.